Hello, how are you doing? I'm looking through some more best books of the year lists, and recently the Washington Post published their 50 notable works of fiction of 2022, which is really interesting to browse through because there are so many books here. Some of these I've read and also loved, others I've been meaning to read, and some of them I've not even really heard of before. That's partly because this is a US publication. I live here in the UK, so some of these books haven't been published in this country yet, or they were published here quite a while ago, which is interesting. But I'm going to go through each of these titles, give brief summaries of them and any commentary I might have about them. I'd love to also know if you've read any of these books and would also recommend them, or if you're interested in reading any of these now, or if there are other titles you'd like to highlight as some of the best books from the past year. Please let me know about that in the comments below. Now, before I get stuck into this list, the Washington Post also published their best books of 2022, which includes fiction as well as non-fiction. So I'm going to look at the first 5 titles on that because they're obviously their tippity-top recommendations from the past year. And to start off with, there's the Nobel Prize for Literature winner from last year, Abdulrazak Gurnah, and his novel Afterlives. Now, this was actually first published here in the UK before the whole prize hoopla happened around this, and it's only just come out in the US now recently. So it's interesting because this didn't get much attention when it first came out here. So what a difference, you know, a prize makes to an author's reputation from going being relatively obscure to, you know, being so famous. It'd be interesting to know in an alternative universe if this, you know, also would have been highlighted if he hadn't won the Nobel Prize. I mean, who knows? But yeah, it's kind of interesting how that works. So this novel is set in East Africa in the early 20th century and focuses on the lives of a number of characters whose lives are affected by colonialism and war. And but rather than, you know, traditionally in this time period that's seen through a very Eurocentric point of view, this focuses very much on the lives of these African characters, how and to show their communities and their lives, but also, yeah, how they are affected by the big political changes and cultural changes that were occurring in the world at that time. Next is a novel which has been much talked about and celebrated already, and rightly so, Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. Such a powerful novel about a boy born into poverty in the American South, and he tells his own tale in a very charismatic and moving way, following his story as he struggles to survive and the many challenges he encounters. And it's such an incredible book. It says so much about America today, and the way Kingsolver creates his voice, and you follow his story. It's so wonderful. I can't praise this book enough. Mecca by Susan Straight. This is a novel set in Southern California in an area not often shown in fiction, and involves the lives of a number of characters who are people of color, many of whom have Mexican or Native American ancestry, and who work in the agricultural or healthcare or hospitality industries, and their experiences of prejudice and violence. Trust by Hernan Diaz. This is a novel set in the early 20th century in New York City and revolves around a very wealthy couple, but gives different perspectives on their lives and where their wealth came from. Mungo by Douglas Stuart, a novel set in the 1990s in Glasgow, and looking at the sectarian conflict through the point of view of a teenage boy named Mungo who's a Protestant, and how he falls for a Catholic boy named James, and their very dramatic tale and his struggles to come of age in this environment. It's so beautiful and powerful. I just loved this book so much. Now on to the 50 notable books of fiction list, starting off with All the Lovers in the Night by Mieko Kawakami, a story of a copy editor living living in Tokyo who survived through a very traumatic episode and has been trying not to think about it, but her process of gradually confronting this past. And Mieko Kawakami is a very good writer. I really enjoyed her novel Breasts and Eggs, and I thought her novel Heaven was so powerful and beautiful. The Books of Jacob, The Great Big Door Stopper by Olga Tokarczuk, also Nobel Prize winner. This novel, which fictionalizes the life of Jacob Frank, a 18th century mystic in Central Europe who was a kind of cult leader who some revered as a messiah and others absolutely condemned. So it gives the many different points of view of his life and context for understanding Europe during this time. City on Fire by Dawn Winslow, which is a crime novel, apparently the first in a trilogy about organized crime in Providence, Rhode Island, and an Irish mobster who gets entangled in a very difficult and violent situation. The Consequences by Manuel Muñoz. These are short stories. Many of them are set in the 1980s in small towns around Fresno. They follow the struggles and heartaches of a number of characters, many of whom are farm workers. Some were born in Mexico and emigrated to the United States. Others were born in the US. And some of the characters are young and old. Some are straight, some are gay. And it's interesting that Susan Straight, the author whose novel I mentioned earlier, she gives a blurb for this novel where she says these stories are evanescent, unforgettable. Cult Classic by Sloane Crosley. This novel is described as a comic mystery about a woman whose life is lived very much on the internet. She wants to settle down, but she keeps following and seeing details about the lives of her exes on social media. Dr. No by Percival Everett, a novel about a brilliant professor of mathematics whose life gets entangled with a supervillain who's hatching a very sinister plot. So Everett's kind of play upon a James Bond type story, but looking at that through a very different lens. And I thought Everett's novel The Trees was excellent. Either Or by Elif Batuman, a comic and intellectual novel following the observations and misadventures of a young woman in her sophomore year at Harvard. This is Batuman's sequel to her novel The Idiot, a novel I enjoyed without fully loving, so I'd like to read this, even though it's not at the top of my TBR pile. Since this is following her sophomore year, I'm kind of curious if Batuman's going to just make this 4 novels following each year of her university life. Fencing with the King. This is a novel about a Palestinian-American woman whose father is invited to the month-long birthday celebrations of the King of Jordan. So she accompanies him there and gradually learns things about her father's past as well as the history of the powers that be. I picked up a copy of this novel when I was in America in the summer, and my friend Christy recommended it, so I'm really looking forward to reading it. Forbidden City by Vanessa. This is a historical novel set in 1960s China about a girl from a small village who joins Chairman Mao's dance troupe and eventually becomes his confidant and lover, so following her story over a number of decades. The Foundling by Ann Leary. This is a novel set in the early 20th century about a young woman who was born an orphan and finds work at a women's mental institution, and there at first she really reveres a female doctor, but when she meets one of the patients who she knew at the orphanage growing up, she learns that there are much more sinister things going on at this institute. So it's meant to be quite a thrilling novel, and also it's inspired by a true story about the author's grandmother. Free Love by Tessa Hadley. This is about a woman in the 1960s who seems to have it all, a loving husband and children, but then she meets a younger man who kisses her, and that changes her entire entire perspective on life. The Furrows by Namwali Serpel. This is a novel about a woman whose brother disappeared when they were younger, and her mother can't let this go and dedicates herself to finding out what happened to him, as well as other missing children. So it's very much about how she's caught between the past and the present. Glory by Novailet Balawayu, set in a fictionalized version of Zimbabwe where all the characters are animals, and the old leader of the country is overthrown in a coup, and there is a lot of political confusion and chaos and violence. It's a novel which is very comic in a lot of ways, I think, but also very astute in its observations about the machinations of power and the difficulty of coming together as a society. Groundskeeping by Lee Cole. This is a novel about a man who comes from a very conservative family. He gets a job as a groundskeeper at a college, and there he meets a woman who's the daughter of Bosnian immigrants and forms a relationship with her. I've not read this novel, but my husband has read this novel, and he said it was good, but not great. So yeah, another one that's probably not at the top of my TBR pile. The Hero of this book by Elizabeth McCracken, about a woman who travels to London and recalls many things about her mother's life. It's described as a memoir, but not a memoir, which I think is always really an interesting line. And Elizabeth McCracken is an author I've read before and really enjoyed. I'd not heard she had a new book out, and now that I know it's about a woman that travels to London, where I live, I'm very keen to read it. Horse by Geraldine Brooks. This is a novel about a racehorse in the mid-19th century and an enslaved boy who trains this horse, but also how a picture of this horse is discovered generations later, and the person who finds it becomes obsessed with this horse. So it seems like a story which gives a very different way of viewing history. How Not to Drown in a Glass of Water by Angie Cruz. This is a novel about a woman in New York who's from the Dominican Republic, and her interactions with a woman who's providing her with employment assistance, and there are many encounters and what they learn from each other. And so this is an author, I read her novel Dominicana, which I really enjoyed. It's actually not been published here in the UK yet, but I just got this copy the other day because it's being published in February here. Invisible Things by Matt Johnson. This is a novel about a group of astronauts that land on a moon of Jupiter's, and they say at first this seems like a science fiction story, but it becomes more a cultural and political satire, and I love novels that are sort of set in outer space but also have bigger meaning to them. He likens it to Kurt Vonnegut's writing, so I'd not heard of this book before, but I'm so keen to read it now. Jackie and Me by Louise Bayard. This novel about President Kennedy and his wife Jackie in their younger years when they were making their way in Washington and when they were still distinct individuals before they became this inseparable team. The Latecomer by Jean Hanf Korelitz. This is a novel about a wealthy New York City family and their conflicts. It's described as part farce, part revenge fantasy, and part latter-day Edith Wharton novel, which really excites me because I love Wharton's books. Less is Lost by Andrew Sean Greer. This is about an author who is struggling financially, so accepts a series of literary gigs across America. So it's a sort of survey of the country, but also about his comic misadventures. This is a sequel to the author's novel Less, which I've not read that book yet, and I've heard quite mixed things about this, so I'm not rushing to get to it. Lessons by Ian McEwan, the author's great big epic novel about a boy whose early experiences very much impact him throughout the rest of his life, and following his journey through a number of decades and through many different politically tumultuous time periods. The Lioness by Chris Beaujolain, a novel about a group of Hollywood notables that set off on a safari across the Serengeti in the 1960s. It's described as a perfect blend of glamour and horror, which I think makes it sound really enticing. Lucky Breaks. This is a collection of short fiction about anonymous women in Ukraine whose lives are upended by the ongoing conflict with Russia. So a very timely book. Lucy by the Sea by Elizabeth Strout, another very timely novel in that it's set during the recent pandemic when a woman named Lucy Barton, who's a writer, her ex-husband takes her to Maine to sort of hide out there because he realizes that the pandemic is coming and that it could be potentially devastating. So it follows the story of their ongoing relationship. This is another book in the Lucy Barton series by Elizabeth Strout, which is so wonderful, and I read the entirety of this novel aloud to my husband while we were on a recent trip. I posted a whole vlog about that trip recently, and yeah, it was such a wonderful experience. The Marriage Portrait by Maggie O'Farrell, a novel that follows a daughter of the Medici family in the mid-1500s in Italy, where she's forced to marry a man that she gradually learns is plotting to kill her. So quite a thrilling, historically immersive story, and I can't get over this beautiful special Waterstones edition I have of the book. It's just really gorgeous, and look at the inside, it's just so beautiful. Mercy Street by Jennifer Haig. This is a story about an experienced counselor at a reproductive health clinic in Boston, and it's about the issue of abortion. I'm looking at it from a number of different perspectives, so another very timely novel. My Phantoms by Gwendolyn Riley, a novel about a woman in her 40s who has an extremely difficult relationship with her parents and exploring the dynamics of that. I've read Gwendolyn Riley in the past and really not gone on with her work. This novel was published last year here in the UK, so I completely avoided it. Night Crawling by Layla Motley. I think this is the breakout debut novel of 2022. Such a moving and terrifying book about a teenage girl that goes into prostitution in order to make ends meet and then gets entangled in a scheme by the police and used and abused by them. Her prose has such poetic power to it. It's just incredible. Olga Dies Dreaming, a novel about a woman in her 40s who lives in Brooklyn and becomes a very in-demand wedding planner, but who struggles to find romance herself. And I love how it describes this as a kind of romantic comedy, so the end isn't shocking, but how it gets there is very surprising. Our Missing Hearts by Celeste Ng, a story set in a near-future dystopian America and a boy who goes on a quest to find his mother, who is a Chinese-American poet that has gone missing, and how he recalls the many fables she told him when he was younger. Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. This is described as both a love story and a horror story about a couple who one of the spouses goes on a deep sea expedition and returns forever changed. It's also kind of likened to a kind of Henry James turn of the screw type story. Sounds so enticing. I've been meaning to read this for ages because I've read Julia Armfield's collection of short stories, which was so good. The Passenger by Cormac McCarthy, a novel which begins as a mystery about what happened to a private jet that's found at the bottom of the ocean and a salvage operation to discover the truth. And this broadens out to become a much more contemplative story about larger issues. This is probably one of the publishing events of the year, and I found it amusing seeing all the sort of bro lit guys sort of rushing to read this book, and Cormac McCarthy's return to fiction after his incredible novel The Road, which was the last book he published in 2006, a novel I absolutely loved, but I've not read any other of McCarthy's books, so I keep meaning to explore more of his past catalog before, reading this new publishing event. The Seven Moons of Mali Almeida by Shehan Karuna-Talaka, one of the breakout books of this year. This novel, which is both a mystery and a horror story and a comedy about a man in Sri Lanka, a photojournalist who has died and is trying to uncover who his killer is. And following that journey, I loved reading this book so much when it was longlisted for the Booker Prize, and I'm so happy it won that award. And it was such a thrill to be there on the night of the Booker Prize. And so I did a whole vlog about this and my conversations with Shehan. Yeah, it's such a wonderful story. Salka Valka by Haldor Laxness, another winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature, but Laxness died in 1998. However, this is the first time this novel has been translated into English. It follows the story of a man in a small village trying to make his way on his own, and this author explores like much bigger themes to do with political and social systems of thought, but through the lens of this one character in a small village. I've enjoyed Laxness's fiction when I've read it in the past, and also I visited Iceland once many years ago, and it's wonderful. You can visit Laxness's house there, which has now become a museum. Sea of Tranquility by Emily St. John Mandel, a novel which on the surface seems like science fiction in that it begins in the past but then moves decades and then centuries into the future, but they note it's much more a story about loneliness, grief, and finding purpose. Now, I've been told that this is very much a sequel to her novel The Glass Hotel, which I've not read yet. I've read Station 11, but I need to go back and read The Glass Hotel before getting to this new book. Shrines of Gaiety by Kate Atkinson, a novel set in 1920s London in seedy Soho, and a woman that's known as the queen of the nightlife there, and following her story and her expectations for her children's lives. I think it's going to be such an immersive historical story, which I'm so looking forward to reading. This is going to be my treat read over the winter. Signal Fires by Danny Shapiro, a novel which begins in 1985 with an accident, but then there is a lot of secrecy around this accident that occurs and how that impacts a family over the years. The Singularities by John Banville, a novel about a man who is just released from prison to return back to the place of his boyhood, but there's a question about whether this is really where he came from and what his identity is, so it seems like a novel of real psychological tension. The Stone World by Joel Agee. This is a novel about a quiet, sensitive boy named Peter in a Mexican town in the 1940s, which I think sounds like such an endearing story, but also this author's father is a Pulitzer Prize winning writer, so I'm very curious about sort of literary dynasties. Thrust by Lydia Yuknovich. This is a novel which is described as kind of like a fever dream, all set around a New York harbor, moving backwards and forwards in time over periods of hundreds of years. I was initially very curious about this book because I read the author's novel The Book of Joan before, which I thought was really interesting, though I didn't wholly love it, and I've heard the themes of this book are a bit too on the nose, so yeah, I sort of passed it on for the time being. To Paradise by Hanya Yanagihara, which I guess was kind of the big publishing event at the very beginning of this year, and this book, which is really 3 novels in one, all centering around one house in New York City, but very different characters and people, although a lot of them have the same names, over very different periods of time, and it's a wonderful experience, and I really enjoyed reading it, but I had some advice going into reading this, which I made a whole video about at the beginning of the year, so I'll link that below. I think it's really worth reading, but yeah, it's quite an epic. Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. This wonderful novel about 2 individuals that meet when they're children, and they form this strong friendship over gaming, and then they become very successful game creators themselves. So following the ups and downs of both their relationship and their professional lives over a number of years. This gave me such a nostalgic hit, but is also just a wonderful story. Trespasses by Louise Kennedy, a novel set in Belfast, and is about a woman whose family owns a pub, and how one day she meets meets a married man there. So it's about love and violence amidst the troubles. True Biz by Sarah Novick, which follows the lives of a number of students at a school for the deaf, as well as one of their teachers, and the sense of community that they create, but also the tensions and the conflicts that arise between them. I've read Sarah Novick's fiction in the past and really enjoyed it, so yeah, I keep meaning to get a copy of this new novel. The Unfolding by A.M. Holmes, a man who wants to take America back after a presidential election doesn't go his way. So following that, but also the different opinions that his family has about this issue. So another very timely novel. Vladimir by Julia May Jones. In this novel, the narrator's husband is accused of sexual misconduct at the college where they both work. So it's about the fallout of that. This is described as a very provocative debut. It's a book I've heard a lot of people talking about, and I'm eager to read myself. We All Want Impossible Things by Catherine Newman. This is very much a novel about female friendship in that it follows two women that have been friends for decades, but one of them receives a terminal cancer diagnosis, so following the tragedy of that situation. But it's described as genuinely both heartbreaking and hilarious. The Whalebone Theatre by Joanna Quinn. This is mostly set in England before and during World War II and follows the story of a very creative girl and her step-siblings and their peculiarities and charm. Yonder by Jabari Asim. This is a novel about four enslaved individuals in the American South in the mid-1800s, and the narrative revolves between their different perspectives, and the story moves towards their eventual exodus from their plantation. So it sounds like a really interesting book. I'd not heard of it before. But yeah, those are the books on the list. Like I said, I'd love to know if you've read any of these and would also recommend them, or if there are some that you're interested in reading now. Yeah, a lot to get through. But I hope you're doing well and reading good things, and I'll speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.